Tanks were used by the British Army for the first time on the Somme in September 1916 during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Those early Mark I tanks changed history and shaped conflict in ways few could imagine then, and then a year later a tank corps had been formed and was about to fight its first major battle as a corps near Ypres in Flanders. But Ypres was not the Somme, and the bombardments of that summer had smashed the ground, turning it into a lunar landscape of shell craters and mud and muck and slime. The tanks bogged down in these conditions as they moved up to make battle, and in one area of the battlefield east of Ypres, along the infamous Menin Road, their wrecks formed a tank cemetery. Follow our journey in this film as we look at the history of the tanks and the story behind that forgotten tank cemetery of World War I. When Europe was plunged into conflict in 1914, European armies predicted a war of movement and that they would soon be home before the leaves fell. Armies wearing uniforms little changed in decades would quickly bring the fighting to an end, and with it victory. But that war of movement went static very quickly, and trench warfare carved a new kind of battlefield across the European mainland on what became known as the Western Front. Generals sought ideas and means to break the stranglehold of trench warfare, and the use of armoured vehicles was one of those, championed by Winston Churchill and the Royal Navy with the building of a landship known as Little Willie. The Army soon took over the project, and the Mark I tank was developed, crewed by personnel from the Army Service Corps and the Machine Gun Corps. Unleashed on the Somme on the 15th of September 1916, their initial effectiveness may have been limited, but by Third Ypres in 1917, there was now a tank corps with the new Mark IV tanks about to take part in the fighting towards Passchendaele. But the battlefield conditions caused many tanks to bog down, get stuck in the mud, and in one area close to the Menin Road, their wrecks formed what became known as the tank cemetery. Using contemporary maps, trench maps, we can see where the tank cemetery was located, just east of the hamlet of Hoog, along the Menin Road, close to a junction known as Clapham Junction, a landscape today that has recovered and changed, but the evidence of this unique part of the First World War landscape remains, and that's where our journey will continue. This is the area of the Menin Road Ridge. The Menin Road runs just behind me here. It's that road that runs from Ypres to Menin, right through the central part of the Ypres salient battlefields, where all 4 years of the war raged. And here, in the late summer of 1917, tanks from the newly formed Tank Corps moved across the ground, which was then open, smashed to bits by shell fire, from left to right across this landscape to move up to make their attack in the next area of the battlefield up towards the village of Passchendaele. And it was hard going because the ground was smashed up by shell fire. There'd been a huge amount of rain. It was very muddy and boggy, and the tanks slowly got into trouble. They got stuck in the mud. Quite a lot of them found it difficult to get up the embankment of the Menin Road, and as they got into the next part of the landscape, they got into even more trouble up there where it was even more boggy and muddy. And the wrecks of those tanks lay there for the rest of the war. There are air photographs like this one showing the Menin Road running here, where on the original you can pick out a number of tanks in this area where we're standing now, up to the far end of the tank cemetery as it became known, just up here. And guidebooks like this took the battlefield visitor in the interwar period up onto that former landscape of the First World War and directed them to locations like this, which rapidly became known as the tank cemetery, because this whole landscape here was covered in the wrecks of these First World War tanks. And they appear in many picture postcards that were bought by these pilgrims in the 1920s and 30s. This one just on the road on the other side of where I'm standing now, and parts of this tank were found in an archaeological dig quite recently. And then there were other wrecks on bunkers, on the edge of large shell holes, and more significantly is this image that ties us down to exactly where we are now, of two of the tanks that had moved out and couldn't get over the bank, the embankment of the Menin Road, and got stuck on the ground just there. So this is one of those parts of the landscape where I can hold out a photograph like this, and it is literally on the spot where that incident took place in the Third Battle of Ypres, and where the wrecks of those tanks remained into the 1920s, when sadly they were eventually scrapped. A few remained by the Second World War, but they were scrapped by the Germans, and there's no trace of the tank cemetery on this part of the landscape today, only a few fragments of it in local museums. But we'll finish our journey by going up to the far side of where the tank cemetery was, and we'll talk about how important these kind of sites were to the battlefield pilgrim in that interwar period. I'm on the northern end of where the tank cemetery was located. It was about a mile or so across from the Menin Road, where we were before on the embankment, to where we are now on the approaches to the Frasenberg Ridge just over here. And there was probably a good couple of dozen tank wrecks scattered across this part of the landscape. And in that interwar period, the battlefield tourists and the pilgrims came here to see these strange monoliths, these wrecks of tanks, and photograph them, to buy postcards of them if they couldn't photograph them themselves, showing these wrecks of these strange metal beasts left on the landscape for all time, apparently, to those people then. And if they had cameras with them, they photographed them. This is a page from a photo album from an interwar visit to the battlefields, wrecked tanks near Hoog and on the Menin Road. And there's a number of photographs of different tanks, including this one, parts of which were found in an archaeological dig close to where we are now some years ago. And what photographs like this tell us is what these people expected to find when they came here. Like us, they were coming to connect with the subject of the Great War, understand it, and seeing these wrecks of mighty tanks laid out like a cemetery across this landscape made them reflect on the conduct of the war, the conditions of the war, and no doubt too on the cost of the war, because many of the people who took photographs like this were coming here to visit the graves of loved ones who had fallen in Flanders fields. So the tank cemetery now long gone for that important interwar period when the pilgrims and the visitors and the tourists came here. This was one of those places that they focused on, that they were drawn to understand that wider subject of the war on the Western Front.